Good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Youssef Munayr. I'm the head of the Palestine-Israel program and a senior fellow here at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar, Palestine Activism on U.S. College Campuses, Dissent, Repressive Policies, and Implications. After months of protests around the world on and off campuses against Israel's war on Gaza, the horrors on the ground against Palestinians grind forward, and many universities have taken steps to repress protests, silence dissent, and eliminate space for free expression. Despite these repressive efforts, however, activism on Palestine continues, and an incoming Trump administration may only accelerate these trends. What has the protest movement on campuses actually looked like, and what has motivated it? What steps are administrators taking to protect academic freedom or violate it? How are faculty members responding? What role are government officials and law enforcement playing? How might this all evolve under a new administration in 2025? And what are the broader implications of the repression of this movement for the United States and its policy in the region? We're very fortunate to have a wonderful panel of experts to talk through these questions and more today. And for this conversation, we'll begin with 10 minutes of remarks from each of the panelists, followed by moderated questions and a Q&A session with the audience. And on that note, please remember that you don't need to wait for the Q&A portion to submit your questions for this morning's speakers. You can send in the questions at any time using the Q&A feature here on Zoom or by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. In the interest of time, I want to move directly to briefly introducing our guests now in the order that they will be presenting and starting the discussion. Jay Ohlfelder is a program director at the Nonviolent Action Lab at Harvard's Kennedy School's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. Sabia Ahmed is a staff attorney at Palestine Legal, leading organization providing legal support to the Palestine rights movement. Nadine Neighbor is professor of gender and in the Gender and Women's Studies program and the Global Asian Studies program at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And Tariq Habash is a fellow at the Center for the Defense of American Freedom and a Leadership in Government fellow at the Open Society Foundation. Welcome to all of you, and thank you all for being with us today. Jay, the mic is yours to get us started. I would love to hear from you about the project that you work on, the data that you've collected about protest activity on campuses, and what the empirical reality really is and how it might differ from some of the narratives that we've seen about these protests in the mainstream conversation.
Yeah, thanks very much for the introduction. As Youssef said, my name's Jay Ohlfelder. I work as the program director at the Nonviolent Action Lab. I spend most of my time in that role working on a project called the Crowd Counting Consortium, which is an 8-year-long collaboration between Erica Chenoweth at Harvard and Jeremy Pressman at the University of Connecticut. And I should say, of course, I'm speaking today in my own capacity, not on behalf of my colleagues or my employer. CCC, as we call the Crowd Counting Consortium, uses news reports and social media to make data on U.S. protest activity of all sorts, again, since 2017. And that includes, of course, actions over the past 13 months in support of Palestine and Palestinian liberation. So what do the data tell us about activism on campus in the last year? For starters, I think it's fair to say that the groundswell of activism on this cause over the past year has been historic, and student activism has been a crucial part of that. Since October 7th, 2023, CCC has logged more than 20,000 pro-Palestine protest events across the country. That's nearly half of all the protests in the United States on any issue during that period, which notably also included a presidential election. Of those more than 20,000 pro-Palestine protests, about 5,000 or one quarter of them have taken place at colleges and universities. So not most of them, but a sizable chunk. Um, on op-ed pages, cable news, that sort of thing, I think we've all seen a lot of kind of snarky stuff about this wave of activism on campuses, in particular, being some kind of hobby project of rich white kids at so-called elite coastal schools. But our data tell a really different story from that. The nearly 5,000 events we've logged have spanned more than 480 different U.S. colleges and universities in almost all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and unsurprisingly, Puerto Rico. Back in August, an independent analysis of our data showed that nearly 2/3 of the pro-Palestine campus protests to that point had occurred at public schools, including a fair number of community colleges, as well as city and state universities in places like Texas, Oklahoma, Utah, Arizona, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, just to name a few of them. I think another kind of mainstream trope about this wave of student activism is that it's been violent. And again, that's not what our data show. We've seen reports of police injuries, something we regularly track at just 10 of those nearly 5,000 protests, compared with protester injuries at 60 of them, sometimes at the hands of police, sometimes at the hands of counter-protesters. And that's consistent with what we've seen off campuses as well. In general, we've seen a lot more physical violence directed at people protesting for Palestinian liberation in the past year than we've seen from them, including numerous assaults with pepper spray and other weapons, and at least a handful of attempted vehicle rammings. The latest one just a few days ago in San Diego. At the same time, we've logged reports of property damage at just 82 of those nearly 5,000 events on campuses, or less than 2% of them. And that's across just 55 of the nearly 500 schools. I mean, in some cases, the property damage was definitely extensive, but in the vast majority, it involved minor vandalism like graffiti and broken windows. So again, not this violent uprising as it's sometimes described. Of course, campus activism on this issue is hardly new. And the current wave began almost immediately after October 7th. But there's no question that the Gaza Solidarity encampments, which mushroomed across campuses in the spring, really drew the public eye. Our data show encampments on 137 different campuses over the past year. These actions have ranged in duration from just minutes in some cases, where police immediately swept the encampment, to 100 days in the longest case. And the median duration was about 9 days. So again, contrary to the popular narrative, most of those encampments, including many of the longest running ones, occurred at public schools. Only 3 of the 10 longest were at private schools, Stanford, Vanderbilt, and Swarthmore. The top 10 also included places like Indiana University in Bloomington, Cal State Los Angeles, University of California campuses in Davis, Santa Barbara, and Santa Cruz, and at Rutgers in New Jersey. Because state and administrative repression of the movement is kind of one of our focal points, if not the focal point today, I just wanted to wrap up the kind of empirical overview by talking a little bit about those aspects. I think it's fair to say that as historic as the scope and persistence of this wave has been, the intensity of the repressive response has also been remarkable. Since October 7th, we've logged more than 3,800 arrests of protesters at pro-Palestine actions on campuses specifically, approaching an average of 1 per event. Those arrests occurred at 102 different schools, or about 1 of every 5 schools that had any pro-Palestine protest activity during this period. Of course, lots of schools also used this past summer to update their policies on campus protest activity in an attempt to drastically shrink the space available to activists, often with a particular focus on the protest modalities that were used by pro-Palestine activists last spring. Our project doesn't systematically track those rule changes, but as others have reported, and I'm guessing we're going to hear and talk more about today, they've clearly been significant and widespread. Our data suggests this crackdown is having some of its intended effect. Roughly 3,200 of those nearly 5,000 pro-Palestine campus protests and more than 3,200 of the arrests all occurred in the first half of this year across 411 different campuses. In the second half of the year, like July 1st on, we've logged fewer than 1,000 pro-Palestine events so far across just 233 campuses. Of course, the semester's not over, but that is certainly a downward trend. The crackdown's also driven campus activists to modify the character of their actions. More than 200 of the nearly 1,000 campus protests we've seen so far this fall have been vigils, up from just 168 among several thousand events in the spring. And we've also seen the proliferation of study-ins, events where participants are gathering quietly in public spaces with signs taped often to their backs of their laptops and often wearing keffiyehs. The project's logged more than 40 pro-Palestine study-ins on campuses so far this semester, compared with just 5 across the entire previous academic year. So again, kind of a shift towards vigils and study-ins and things that are arguably in some ways less confrontational. And of course, we've also seen a fair number of rallies outside courthouses in conjunction with hearings and trials for people who've been arrested at previous campus actions. A pessimist might look at those trends and conclude that the movement's fading in some sense, that the repressive response to it is doing real damage. And as I said before, there's some truth to that, but the number and sizes of events are down. It does feel like, in some ways, a bit of a step backwards when organizers have to focus their energy on actions like study-ins and court support that are inherently limited in their scope and that are as much about the repression of activism as they are about the violence and injustice that activism is aiming to stop or undo. But I'll wrap up with a more optimistic take. I think that the fact that the current wave of pro-Palestine activism persists at such a large scale so long after it started, and with such geographic and social breadth, again, we're continuing to see events every day all across the country, is historically exceptional. Just today, there are coordinated pro-Palestine actions occurring on dozens of campuses across the country, including a pre-dawn occupation of a building at Sarah Lawrence College. Movement surges rarely last this long on any issue, let alone one ostensibly centered overseas. So a tremendous amount of organizing's happened over the past year as well. And I think the tactical shifts we're seeing this fall on and off campuses are indicative of a movement that now stands, a real chance of weathering and adapting to state and administrative repression, even as that repression continues to intensify. So that's my 2 cents. I'll stop there and look forward to hearing from the other speakers.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Jay. Really useful to hear the numbers and to kind of get a sense of what this unprecedented moment has looked like in all of its diversity. I want to turn now to Sabia Ahmed from Palestine Legal to provide an overview about the different types of restrictions that students have been facing from the school administrations and how they've been challenged legally or through other forms of administrative recourse at the university level, and sort of more broadly outline how Palestine Legal has been responding to the unprecedented situation this year.
Sure, thank you, Yusuf. So I want to start by just where this repression comes from and the restrictions that we're seeing against student protesters at universities. And talking about, the phenomenon that underlies this is anti-Palestinian racism at these college campuses that are systematically discriminating against, dehumanizing, and smearing students as violent, excluding them on their own campuses and censoring them. I just want to highlight that framework and understand as underlying a lot of the different policies that we've been seeing at universities attempting to restrict students. And this is against, Palestinian students, but also those who are Arab, are Muslim, are those who associate with Palestinians, not only Palestinians themselves. And so some of the different ways that we've been seeing restrictions at universities play out over the last year. I'll start with one that started this summer and has continued into the fall, which is new policies that schools have been instituting against students, against their free expression on campuses. And this kind of goes to what Jay was talking about, that there was, a huge surge in protest, especially in the spring with the encampments that we saw across universities. And so in response to a lot of the actions that the students put on over the previous school year, schools kind of, retreated this summer and into the fall to come up with new policies, new ways to restrict student protest. And so these policies range from banning things like encampments on their campuses. They put restrictions on where protests can happen on campus, for how long, between certain hours. They even have restrictions on what can be worn at protests. So we've seen schools try to institute like mask bans on campus, preventing students from wearing masks. And as we know, this presents many different challenges, including the fact that many students want to be safe from things like COVID, which is still happening, and are being prevented from wearing a mask at these protests. There's also some universities which have put in policies requiring anyone who wears a face covering to show identification if asked. So again, a way to kind of control who is a part of these protests, to intimidate those who want to be a part of an action on their campus. And so, these new policies are just one way. And although we did see a surge of these happen at the beginning of the fall semester, we're still seeing schools who hadn't put in policies continue to try to make those changes as we go into the spring. Another restriction related to policy changes is just the surge of conduct charges against students who take part in protests on their campuses. And these can be for things like taking down posters on campus. They can be for encampment participation. It's just a whole range of things. And these aggressive student conduct charges are being brought against students, sometimes with little to no due process at all. There have been cases where just an entire large group of students have been brought in for something like a building occupation or an encampment, with no actual individual evidence being presented to the students in a timely manner. They're just being brought in as a group and expected to take part in a fishing expedition by the school and kind of expose themselves in that process. These conduct processes are resulting in things like suspension, in some cases expulsion. And tied to that, we're seeing students who have been, evicted from their on-campus housing and struggling last minute to try to find somewhere to go, and losing access to things like on-campus meals, and other things they would be entitled to as students. And another thing to highlight with these processes that we're seeing is, as I mentioned, a lack of due process. So many times we're seeing these processes being dragged on for a lengthy amount of time, where students, even if eventually it doesn't result in something like suspension or expulsion, they're being left in this essentially like a purgatory, waiting to see what's going to happen. And that process in and of itself is a threat to students, is intimidating, is meant to intimidate students. And it's a way to obviously chill free expression of students on these campuses. Another trend that we're seeing is just schools banning outright their SJPs. SJP is Students for Justice in Palestine, which is a group that exists on many campuses. It holds, rallies, protests, different events in an effort to fight for Palestinian liberation. And these groups are being suspended by their universities in some cases, and others where these groups don't exist on a campus, they're being prevented from forming at all. And sometimes the universities say that, well, we don't want disruption on our campus, or we see how SJPs at other universities are, and we don't want that on our campus. So that's being used as a reason to prevent SJPs from existing on campus. And then another reference to what Jay was talking about in terms of violence at the protests being, in many cases, a result of police brutality. So what students have encountered at protests, too many times, is a coordinated repressive assault, with universities, along with state, local, and campus police working together to enact violence on them. So between late April to mid-May, which is when a big surge of the encampments happened across campuses, university administrators called in law enforcement to arrest over 3,000 students, professors, and solidarity activists on more than 80 campuses. And I want to give an example of a place where we saw this happen at Emory University in Atlanta. The school had campus police, but there was also Atlanta police and Georgia State Patrol brought in to violently respond to a student encampment. And at this protest, we saw police use tear gas and pepper balls against protesters. They brutally attacked not only students, but also there was a professor who they like slammed into the concrete. There was all these really violent things that happened at this protest. And unfortunately, this is not an outlier. There are other universities where we've seen, you know, real just brutality and violence by police, and universities allowing this to take place on their campuses, which is also, you know, really disturbing, having this coordination between different police forces. Um, and that, you know, violence is not something of just the last year, school year. It's also been carried out into the fall as well. And so, you know, with these different types of repression, there are different ways that not only Legal, but other organizations and students also have been trying to push back against this repression. So, you know, one way we are a legal organization is through litigation. We had a lawsuit earlier this semester against the University of Maryland, where the university was preventing their SJP from holding a vigil on October 7th after initially approving it. And the way that they went about trying to prevent this vigil was by putting an outright ban on any student events on October 7th. University of Maryland is a public university, also to highlight that. And so CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, along with Palestine Legal, took this to court, and it was a success. The students won and were able to hold their vigil, and it was extremely well attended. Some really beautiful pictures came out of that event. So, you know, litigation is one way. However, there are some, you know, drawbacks to litigation because the law is not, you know, usually made to protect things like what we're fighting for. It's often made to suppress these things. And so one recent lawsuit that we had was against Columbia for suspending their Students for Justice in Palestine chapter, and also JVP, which is Jewish Voice for Peace. And in that lawsuit, the judge dismissed our petition and took Columbia's side, saying they didn't see a problem in what Columbia was doing, that they didn't see Columbia breaking any of their policies, actually. And this, you know, decision sends a really horrifying message to universities, saying that they can just break their policies and they'll be fine. The way that Columbia just suspended their SJP and JVP without any sort of hearing or going through normal university processes. So I think this example just shows, you know, litigation is one way to push back, but the law can be limiting. And so no matter the setback, students continue to push. And I know I'm coming up on time, so I just want to add just a couple more things, which is another way to push back, and we can get into this later in the Q&A, is just, you know, student conduct hearings, ensuring that there's an attorney present during student conduct hearings, or a supportive faculty person, someone there to support the students, in addition to calling attention to university repression where we see it, and making sure we are publicly shaming the schools where we see this happen.
Thank you so much for that. And I really appreciate the overview that you gave, especially when you made clear what have been some of the responses from the judges to some of these legal challenges. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of that in the weeks and months ahead. I do want to turn now to Nadine to kind of give us the perspective of a faculty member on campus during this moment. What is the role of faculty as students' rights are being violated by the administrations. How have faculty responded? And please tell us about Faculty for Justice in Palestine. I know that that's an organization that you are involved in, its importance, and sort of where you see that going. And finally, what restrictions are faculty themselves facing on campuses when it comes to academic freedom and expression?
Thank you so much, Yusuf, and thanks to the Arab Center and all the amazing speakers. I'm learning so much. Well, a few themes about faculty in relation to the violation of student rights and far beyond. I want to just start by setting up that, of course, we know that universities are key targets, and because universities are supposed to be speech havens, but what we're seeing is this extremely dangerous growing alliance between Zionist and right-wing organizations using McCarthy-style attacks, we already know. So the FJP, Faculty for Justice in Palestine Network, is part of a broad effort to reclaim and protect colleges and universities from those who are fueling this erosion of academic freedom and free speech. And so another way to think about that is that we're working to maintain the integrity of higher education. And it's kind of one way to think about that is affirming the difference. Like how we see it is that there's a difference. And I want to urge all of us to, maybe consider this between the institution and the campus. So what that means is that many of us have been fighting, for this refusal to let go of our institutions and reclaim our campuses as campuses for and by the people, the public, and the students and the communities they are meant to serve, especially public universities. So we've seen, with the first Trump administration, you could think back to the deportations of undocumented students. And even if a university was forced to comply, it doesn't mean the campus has to reply, right? We set up sanctuary campuses. People formed rings around buildings where maybe the forces were coming in to deport people. So the campus is ours, and it's ours to make and remake. And that's something I learn often from my comrade Shireen Say Ali, who's played a key role, and many of us know her. So it's kind of the idea that FJP says we cannot cede that ground, the ground of the university. And so what have we done? We now have 150 branches across the US, universities and colleges. We respond doing political education and legal workshops. We mediate with administration. But I want to just raise a few issues before I get into some examples and areas where we work, is that it's really important to not think of Palestine as a single issue or isolate the attacks on Palestine activism. Our work as faculty must grow alongside the struggle against neoliberal austerity and neo-fascist suppression. So FJP is a necessary resource in that broader struggle, in the struggle that's to come, the escalating attacks on gender studies, on critical ethnic studies, and DEI. So faculty, we have come to this place where we, like what I was saying, really, where we saw this with the war on terror, the attack on Middle East studies and Palestine studies. So it's kind of part of this broad thing. And then also FJP, there's a struggle really across universities where Ivy Leagues are sort of set up as like this story to be told around campus repression. And I want to affirm that we want to, I want to suggest challenging the reference to Ivy Leagues as the end all be all of the campus struggle. That story that we see in the media and the one that gets centered doesn't capture what it means, what all these struggles have meant across campuses that have different levels of disparity, with working class immigrant students, with junior colleges, community colleges. So we don't want the story of the movement to be told through only the story of the Ivy Leagues, because of course, as we can imagine, public universities of all sorts face different kinds of struggles. Students who don't have access to lawyers, they might not participate in an encampment, or students who are supporting their families. That struggle is going to play out differently. And a lot of those stories are not told because there's such a stronger and higher price to pay for telling that story, even reporting an attack. So you don't even know what's even happening in those cases. And there are a lot of different ways that policing plays out on campuses, public universities with large diverse working class students, where it's not just targeting you for protesting, it's targeting you for like walking through campus with a beard or and all that. Getting cops in my campus, University of Illinois, we've had 4 police officers walk into a classroom and handcuff a working class immigrant Muslim woman, Palestinian student with handcuffs and transfer her to Chicago Police Department. So these are the stories that we don't talk enough about. So I haven't even really begun to talk about FJP, and I know I've already said a lot, so I'll just go and try to summarize a bit. Well, I guess, and to wrap up that point about how do we think about faculty organizing more broadly, not just around Palestine, and we could think about what happened with the protests against the Vietnam War as well, in terms of students weren't just protesting the Vietnam War and faculty, they were protesting the erosion of the social contract in the United States and the resources being taken out of universities and put into the war machine. And we're seeing that with funding being taken out of DEI and given to campus police. So that's like another whole can of worms around the propagandist discourse on campus safety and how the idea of campus safety is now a cover for more policing. And then we can also think about Zionists weaponizing Title VI, which was supposed to be there to protect civil rights, but is the main avenue that these Zionist discrimination cases against students for quote unquote anti-Semitism. So in this sense, there's this alliance between what the Trump administration plans to do with higher ed more broadly and Zionist forces aligning in that repression. So what does FJP do in the face of all this? And I'll just summarize this and wrap up. And I'm actually not keeping track of time, so feel free to interrupt me. So I'll just wrap this up briefly to say that, yes, FJP supports students and works with students. And we use our status, we could say, to work with administration. We use the tool of faculty governance. So we public responses, resolutions, censures, votes of no confidence in leadership. We've seen several of those, like University of Michigan just had a no confidence vote that faculty voted to censure their board of regents, work stoppages. And then when it comes to protests, de-escalation, using our status to, contributing to keeping students safe that, the universities are failing to do. And all of this must happen only when students agree and want faculty there. So there's also that balance around supporting students, mentoring if they would like us to, and also respecting their decisions if they disagree with us. So de-escalating, like for NYU, we saw faculty forming circles around student protesters, challenging the administration for not doing their job with suspending students. Faculty can jump in to make the case for violations so that we shift to alternative forms of punishment. So rather than suspending students, what's another restorative justice strategy? We do that on our campus. Like, what if we come up with another system rather than calling the cops for graffiti? What if there's a hotline holding campus cops accountable through, demanding restorative justice processes, like I said. So what else do I want to say that I think is important about FJP with my 20 pages of notes? I'll just say that I want to uplift some of the successes before I close out on huge success. I think our greatest success has been shifting the AAUP's position on academic boycott. That's probably the largest achievement of FJP campaigns. So what that means is that the American Association of University Professors had a ban on boycotts previously. But now that they've retracted it due to our organizing, there's now this sense that university administrators can no longer, I mean, they can, but it's more difficult to say that pro-Palestine advocacy is out of alignment, with general university principles. And then second is the boycott of study abroad programs in Israel. That's been another area of success. I could talk about that in question and answer if you want, but generally, in short, the idea is that study abroad programs are racist and discriminatory because it's already so well established, and the federal government has already affirmed that Israel discriminates against Arab, Palestinian, and Muslim Americans upon entry. And so how could a university have a program that discriminates against one student population? So this idea that those programs are discriminatory. So therefore we should, shut them down. And then the third would be divestment campaigns. That's the third area that faculty for Dissent Palestine work on. And that's a mixed bag. There have been some successes and some backsliding from administrators who made hollow promises during the encampment saying that, oh yeah, we're going to divest. And then, that turned out to not be the case. So what faculty for Dissent Palestine can do around divestment is really, education is really important because there's a lot of misunderstanding about how to organize for divestment. For example, a lot of groups might think that, our campus hasn't disclosed the investment, so we can't organize around divestment. But you really don't need to know what the investments are to organize for divestment, as an example. So faculty for Dissent Palestine will do a lot of that work around, moving that organizing forward in places where groups have been stuck. Another misunderstanding is sort of that if the endowments are held in funds managed by professional investment managers, then there's a sense that therefore, that those aren't university funds, but you can still organize around divestment despite these. And I won't tell you how, because you need to get involved. And then through getting involved in divestment, you can learn more about it. And then, so what repression are faculty facing? I'll just give you a list. Attack, censorship, doxing, blocked hires, rescinded job offers, refusing to reappoint faculty, terminating employment, suspending professors, but more recently, terminating tenured professors. We've just seen a recent case, not for the first time, but one of the first times with Maura Finkelstein from Muhlenberg College in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And also Nicole Wen, who was just had her job offer rescinded at Dartmouth. And what I like to say about this topic, and this is from a piece published by Amira Jarmarkani. She outlines this. I recommend looking it up. I can post the link. I just want to say that historically, Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim professors disproportionately are targeted as faculty. However, they tend not to report being targeted. And I think it's really important that we recognize the distinct racism at play. If you are Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim and a faculty member, you're going to have a disproportionate experience with targeting compared to others. And we don't have the numbers because people tend to remain silent because it can be scary to talk about it in public. So, and also faculty of color in general, we're seeing, Asian American, Black faculty, et cetera, being singled out intentionally by Zionists. So I will end there on that lovely note and look forward to question and answers.
Thank you so much, Nadine. Really appreciate it. And before, before we turn to Tara, I just want to quickly remind our audience, as we will move to Q&A after that you can submit your questions for the panelists through the Q&A feature here on Zoom, or you can send them in via email to events@arabcenterdc.org. So with that, I want to turn to Tara. Tara, if you could kind of round out this conversation by talking about federal education policy and how it relates to these issues, how it can and is being weaponized for repressive purposes, and what the history is of this over recent decades and how you potentially see it evolving with a new administration.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Yusuf, and thank you, Arab Center DC, just for hosting this webinar. We've had so many great points already be hit on, and I think like even in the context of how we think about the laws and protections that exist from the federal government for students and across institutions, I think that last point that Nadine really had raised about the fact that you see an underreporting by Arab and Muslim faculty when they are experiencing, that type of those types of complaints, that type of discrimination. I think it is very much mirrored by the same communities of students who are experiencing discrimination and experiencing hate and not reporting. Part of that is like functionally how we are reaching vulnerable populations and how we are communicating with them about the tools that they have to be able to, raise these concerns that there is discrimination happening. Part of it is just systemic and decades-long, normalization of discrimination of Arab and Muslim populations that need to be really underscored as we are talking about this work. And so when we come back to like, okay, what is federal policy? What are the protections for students, and how does the government actually think about them? The primary law that the Department of Education really thinks about and leverages in terms of protecting students is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That law essentially says like that you are not allowed to discriminate against any individual based on their race, color, or national origin in any programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. When that comes to education, whether it's K-12 schools, which essentially all have received some level of federal assistance, or any institutions of higher education, which is what we're talking about here, which almost all of the 6,000 schools that operate that by name are essentially eligible for federal financial aid, whether that's Pell Grants, whether that's student loans, whether that's other types of support that goes directly to the institution. That essentially requires schools to ensure that they are protecting all students from discrimination if it is based on those categories: race, color, national origin. And these protections apply to all students. And so one thing that you'll notice that I did not mention is prohibition of religious discrimination. Title VI does not explicitly prohibit religious discrimination, but it does protect students from discrimination based on national origin. And over the years, dating back to 1992, the Department of Education has done a lot of analysis of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to actually understand, okay, how do we think about religious discrimination? And even though it is not explicitly protected, there are guidance documents, there are sub-regulatory analysis the department has done to essentially make it clear that religious discrimination is also a violation of Title VI. And so how the department thinks about that, and this is something that has been talked about for many years now, is protecting students from harassment based on a student's actual or perceived shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics, or citizenship or residency in a country where there is a dominant religion or a distinct religious identity. And this essentially covers the gamut. It protects students who are Muslim, it protects students who are Palestinian, it protects students who are Israeli, it protects students who are Jewish. How that is actually applied is where things start to get a little bit complicated, because what we have seen, especially over the last year, is more guidance to institutions where the Department of Education, because of the complaints that it receives from students, is trying to be a little bit more explicit about when schools are not actually doing a good job of protecting students who are complaining about that type of discrimination. And there are essentially two legal frameworks that the Department of Education, the Office for Civil Rights, announced in May of 2024 that it would essentially rely on to determine whether there is discrimination that is happening on these college campuses. Number one, if there is a hostile environment that is created, encouraged, accepted, tolerated, or left uncorrected by a school, and I'll come back to this one. Or two, if a student who was subjected to different treatment by a school representative. And so the way that this is done in practice is on a case-by-case basis. The Department of Education investigators receive complaints, they open cases, they spend a lot of time making determinations because these are not cut and dry. One thing could be discrimination in one scenario. The same thing could not be discrimination in another scenario because it is contextualized in a broader analysis that the department does. But a lot of that analysis is subjective in nature. And I think bears the question of, well, okay, well, what categories are we actually using to make those determinations if there is a hostile environment, or if a student in that normalized scenario would have been treated differently if their identity was different. And that is where I think there is real concerns about the weaponization of these laws and the possible abuse that could come under a new political leadership, under different political analyses. And when we talk about the broader context of how we have seen external forces try and influence institutions of higher education about how these laws can apply, should apply, and how schools are actually protecting students, we've seen politicians in particular try and put their thumbs on the scale. We've seen congressional hearing after congressional hearing from the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, from the House Judiciary Committee, call presidents of college campuses to Congress and essentially berate them about what they determine as quote unquote anti-Semitic behavior when they are actually talking about essentially pro-peace protests by students on college campuses. And regardless of how the university leadership actually respond, we've seen the political backlash be so significant that there has become this like chilling effect that we've seen on college campuses. We've seen this shift in terms of how colleges and universities are responding. And it is not actually consistent with how the Department of Education does these investigations. And so when we talk about the law, we also need to talk about how the politics are affecting the law. And so going back to Yusuf, your question about some of this history as well, before the Biden administration came in, the Trump administration issued an executive order 13899, I believe it was, which essentially said that federal agencies are required to consider what the IHRA definition for anti-Semitism, which essentially at a high level takes a very broad approach to what could be considered anti-Semitism. And it included criticisms of Zionism, and it included criticisms of the Israeli government. And because of that, there has been essentially within the broader process, some level of consideration of that definition. At the same time, we've seen Congress for numerous sessions, not just in the last few years, but also going back to 2018, 2016, consider laws that would actually codify that definition and make into law that it would be considered considered anti-Semitic and considered part of the civil rights framework to consider it discriminatory, to essentially speak in dissent against the Israeli government, which is extremely problematic for a number of reasons. But when these things start being incorporated into the legal framework, start being added into the investigatory framework of how the Department of Education and how civil rights agencies are actually implementing these policies and making determinations about whether a student is being treated differently based on these categories, and they're taking an overly broad definition to apply that analysis, it creates really dangerous precedents for how the law can actually be weaponized in the future. And so that is like kind of like going back a little bit to where the Trump administration back in 2019 was, and fast forward to where we are today. That executive order was not rescinded by the Biden administration. And while it is not actually codified within the regulations, it is something that is still part of the broader framework of consideration that investigators can be thinking about. All of this to say, it is very likely in the near term, over the next few years, that we actually see the law going in the wrong direction. And what that actually means in the context of some of the complaints that the Department of Education will and is continuing to receive as they are doing those investigations is that definition that would consider criticisms of the Israeli government as it continues its aggression against Palestinians in Gaza and expanding into the West Bank, expanding into Lebanon and other parts of the region, there's going to be real ramifications for continued student activism, continued anti-war, pro-peace speech and organizing on college campuses, and how that is going to be essentially weaponized further to silence and repress students on campus. And even in the context of something that incoming President Donald Trump said just in the last couple weeks, there will be efforts to actually leverage the law to essentially cut off schools from federal aid in circumstances where the Department of Education makes those determinations that actually, in fact, what is happening is against how the department is going to implement these laws. And so if schools do not essentially align with this new analysis, if it becomes law or if future Trump administration makes it part of their broader analysis to use that specific definition, if they don't repress or if they don't stifle speech against an Israeli government, then a school could be at risk of actually losing its federal aid. And for a lot of schools, maybe not the Ivy Leagues, but coming back to the community colleges, the regional four-year schools, a lot of public schools and nonprofit schools that are reliant on these resources to continue operating, they're going to be in a situation where they actually either have to silence and repress that speech, or they're at risk of financial instability and potentially shutting down. And that's a really, really dangerous circumstance. And coming back to one of the last things that Nadine also mentioned, because I thought this was really important, this is starting with Palestine's speech. And it is absolutely dangerous. But when we think about the institution, when we think about the future of academia and higher education, we are going to see these types of, essentially this playbook be reused across other issues that will affect marginalized communities in ways that will require schools to pick sides and pit their students and their faculty against the interests of politicians and against the interests of their donors who want to decide what can be talked about and what is off limits.
Thank you so much for all of that, Tariq. I want to move now to some questions that I have for all of you, and then we'll take some questions from the audience as well. I really appreciate all of your contributions, and you've given us so much to think about and chew on here. Jay, I want to start with you. I was really fascinated by the data that you described. I think it's so important that collection effort is taking place. You know, you talked about the repressive activity that you log against Palestine related protests. But you also mentioned, of course, that, you know, while these protests make up a good chunk of protests around the country, they're not the only protests that you guys are keeping track of. I wonder, how does the repressive activity that we see directed against Palestine protests in the data differ, if in any way, from the kinds of repressive action taken against non-Palestine related protests? Do we see any differences there? And then relatedly, you know, one of the things that we had heard mentioned was about how specific individuals, particularly Palestinians, Arabs and Muslims, people of color, and women as well, are most vulnerable as targets of repression. Do you guys collect any information about the identity of individuals who are targeted with arrest? And if so, you know, do we see any sort of patterns there when it comes to, you know, the identity of people who are targeted?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. We do obviously track the similar kinds of things for all sorts of protests that we look at. And it's hard to make a direct comparison because, of course, there are not other movements we've seen in the last couple of years that have employed, you know, sort of similar modalities. on or off campuses and been at this scale. I mean, I think that, certainly the closest recent analog is back to the summer of 2020 and the Black Lives Matter uprising, and a long history documented in a number of academic studies of more intense police repression of activism, particularly anti-police activism. So there's certainly a parallel there, but also, yeah, against. I'm thinking of New York City, for example, where there's a lot of independent journalists who've done a great job documenting the differential treatment that, and in the last year, this has often been anti-genocide, pro-Palestinian liberation actions. Prior to that, it was often anti-police brutality, anti-racism actions of, sort of really selectively enforcing, like, oh no, you need to stay on the sidewalk here, or, oh no, you can't use a megaphone because that's against the rules, and using those as pretexts to get aggressive with marchers and crowds, to arrest, snatch and grab people from crowds, often targeting organizers. And you don't see that at, activism around virtually any other issues in the city. So, there is certainly, I think, while I can't quantify it, I can qualitatively say from watching all this that there absolutely is differential treatment that parallels what we see against other marginalized groups and other groups protesting against police or state repression and state violence in general. On your second question, no, we don't. We actually, so the unit of observation in our data is the protest event, and we actually try to be careful not to get too much sort of uniquely identifying information about participants in protests. That there's actually we worry a little bit about striking this balance between being a good resource for academics and activists and journalists and being unwittingly instrumentalized as another vector of repression against those activists. And so we don't, as part of our project, track, particular individuals. I suppose you could anonymize that and all, but that kind of gets a couple steps away from what we primarily do. Yeah. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Jay. Sabia, I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about some of the free speech implications of restrictions on phrases or slogans or articles of clothing, and how often we're seeing these sorts of restrictions play out, either officially or unofficially, on campuses or elsewhere in the protest space.
Sure. So I think, some of the phrases that have become really common as part of Palestine protests are things like "from the river to the sea." Also a mention of the word intifada, which has been weaponized by opposition to try to synonymize that with terrorism. And I think that's one of the ways that we've seen universities try to address things like this at protests is with policies that might say something like, we accept free speech, we want free speech on our campuses, but we don't want any language that threatens anybody, that is inherently threatening. And so when we see policies that are that have been outlined, after the spring protests and that are just now being introduced into campuses, I think it looks really targeted, like these sorts of phrases in school policies. The fact that they're highlighting this right now as a response to student protests. And so this sort of language in school policies, not only does it try to censor students from saying things like "from the river to the sea," but it also puts a target on students' backs by trying, again, what I said before, to synonymize what they're saying with support for terrorism. And that is a lot of how not just schools, but third parties outside of the university who try to go after student protesters, who try to dox them online. That is a big part of their narrative, is to take these phrases and say that this is support for terrorism as opposed to a call for Palestinian liberation.
I wanted to also ask you a second question about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. We heard a little bit about that as well, and specifically about the role of the courts here. What have we seen so far in terms of court decisions on how or when this is applied or used, and sort of what do you expect on this front in the future, as this may be a weapon that is more consistently deployed against protest activity?
Sure. So I think in terms of the IHRA definition, one way that we've seen this come up recently, not necessarily in the court context, but kind of speaking to what Tarek was saying about the Title VI context and OCR, I think that is one. Over the years, there have been attempts to try to make the IRA definition a part of what the Department of Education considers when it looks at Title VI complaints about anti-Semitism. And just to give some context to those who are listening who don't know what IRA is, it's the International Holocaust Remembrance Act Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And there are several examples that it gives for anti-Semitism, on its website, and several of those include Israel. And so this definition has been adopted by various institutions and countries as a way to make anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism seem, aligned and the same. And so there's a real danger and threat for this definition to be adopted by the Department of Education. I think that's one way that we see, under the Trump administration, we'll see what happens with that. I think that is one fear and worry, that it will be used that way and continue to be weaponized against students.
Thank you so much. Nadine, I wanted to ask you, you talked about the need to not isolate Palestine from other issues. Can you talk about how the forces that are aiming to repress Palestine have a broader agenda that isn't limited to Palestine, but also seeks to do much more? And what is it that they would really like to accomplish?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Especially as it relates to the university in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I would put it is that those forces, Zionist groups inside and outside the university, I could be wrong, but I would say they are single issue oriented. But I really would love to hear what other panelists think as well. However, their agenda dangerously aligns with, enables, justifies, rationalizes broader right-wing agendas. Meaning what they have accomplished, right, are these new policies that have been institutionalized at many universities. I don't know how many, but a majority of universities, I would say, the time, place, and manner policies, where overnight we saw, especially between last academic year and this, by the time fall emerged, many universities had put into place these new policies about when and how you protest, and how you protest. And those were initiated through Zionist pressure. But those were specifically meant to quell resistance around Israel. However, at the same time, right, there is this movement that we know of, the right-wing pressure to entirely change higher education. With like I was talking about, the teaching about, I'm a head of a gender and women's studies department. I'm on an email list with all heads of all gender women studies programs across the US. And we're talking about whether we're going to be able to teach gender ideology starting in January, And so, of course, what the Zionists are justifying their organizing around repressing activism as well as free speech through the manipulation of anti-Semitism, right? That it's almost like the argument made for these new policies is primarily anti-Semitism. However, the policies are not about anti-Semitism. They affect everything and everyone. So for example, I'm sorry if I'm being unclear, the organizing says that, the Zionist organizing says, all of these departments and faculty and are teaching and posting on their websites and protesting about X, Y, and Z, and that's anti-Semitic. Therefore, departments should not be allowed to put any statement on their website that does not have to do directly with what that department, that department's area of research, or, they're not allowed to put out political statements on their websites. So it's framed as a response to anti-Semitism. However, that same tactic is what is happening more broadly by the right. So I think that one of our strategies in the period to come is to expose the parallel alignment between the Zionists, who are still claiming to stand on the right of civil rights, with the right-wing fascist repressive forces. I mean, that's really what the battle is going to be ahead, so I'll leave it at that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, perhaps the most ironic thing about this repressive effort is that it is dressed up as an effort to protect civil rights.
Exactly.
I want to ask you also, Nadine, about what we've seen or heard so far about efforts to try to control the syllabi or the course content of faculty, whether it's on this issue or other issues, by universities or by lawmakers. Or by donors. What have we seen on that front?
First, I was going to say, I don't think I have enough knowledge of the specifics around that. But what I can say is that rather than me speaking about institutional policing of syllabi, I mean, I've seen institutional policing of syllabi on Palestine, Israel for over 20 years. And the way it happens is that, Zionist students start complaining, and then it goes to, at some universities, I was at University of Michigan, and my syllabi was policed over 10 years ago when I was there, where I can't remember who the office is, but the administrative office that works on curriculum, called me into their office and asked me to add, 2 sides to my syllabus. But so I don't know exactly how, if there are new policies or, what exactly is happening. But what I do know is happening is more of the outside pressure on faculty about their course content. So I don't know if I can't speak to the institution doing it, but I can speak to the political organizing by Zionist groups and student groups like, Hillel and Zionist faculty are playing a huge role in more of intimidation and doxing faculty for what they're teaching. So you could see, a Twitter feed on it. Then the next day, 1 million reposts about this faculty being a terrorist supporter, and all these really dangerous accusations related to faculty teaching. So it's more of like an intimidation and fear tactic type of situation.
Thank you, Nadine.
And lastly, I'll just say one last thing is, I think what's really important to note is that, to your first question and to the second, is that Zionists are going after departments that are where most faculty tend to be people of color, women, queer people. They're going after DEI centers. They're going after, African American studies, Asian American studies, women's studies, gender and sexuality centers, women's leadership and resource centers. So these are DEI centers and departments teaching about race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. These are the primary targets of Zionist faculty and Zionist organizations inside and outside campuses who are making the case that these, in these different units are anti-Semitic. So, that's something we need to call out, that how is it that the places by and for people of color, right, are being targeted for being racist against Jews?
Yeah,
and it's really dangerous because these are the people who are most vulnerable on campus already. And so I think we need to call it out as white supremacist and racist.
Yeah, they're most vulnerable, and also those efforts will find the most existing traction in a society where there is so much entrenched racism already, and there is, of course, powerful, right-wing agendas that are aimed at not just Palestine, of course, but all of the various different topics and communities that that you listed there, Nadine. Tara, I want to ask you, can you talk a little bit about Title VI investigations and specifically how they impact universities, and how universities, might respond to dealing with them, or perhaps even preemptively respond to the threat of having to deal with them? You're on mute.
Man, I'm always so good about not talking on mute. Sorry about that. So Title VI investigations, like I said, like they are done oftentimes following complaints that the Department of Education, the Office for Civil Rights, receives from students about a university, about circumstances where they feel that there was discrimination that occurred, where they experienced discrimination, harassment. And the Office for Civil Rights will open up investigations based on some of the information that they receive. They send investigators, they evaluate the circumstances, they have conversations with the staff, they follow up as needed. And these investigations are very resource intensive. They take a long time. But the idea is, like, the law exists. There are obviously a lot of rules that they are responsible for, ensuring compliance of. And when investigators make determinations that a school is out of compliance with those laws or with those rules, the Office for Civil Rights will essentially issue a corrective action plan. They will tell schools, this is what you need to be doing so that you are not in violation of Title VI. The biggest kind of hammer that the department can use, essentially say, we are going to cut off your access to federal aid because you continue to allow this discrimination to persist across your communities. That is a tool that is very, very, very rarely used. And oftentimes, these letters that issue directives to universities about what they can do, they often will establish, some additional oversight. There will be essentially like a probationary period where they are continuing to be in dialogue with the Office for Civil Rights. They are taking other additional steps to mitigate some of the biggest areas of discrimination. And oftentimes these cases are opened up because of, like an instance or a couple instances of discrimination, but they could be more broadly about the entire environment and the culture of the university that could be, in fact, allowing a pervasive level of discrimination and harassment. And those are circumstances where, you see a little bit more serious, responses from the government. When it comes to actually seeing these levers being used in ways that would push universities to actually be more proactive I think you are seeing it less because of the investigations themselves, although I do think when a university sees that a case is opened against them or opened at the Department of Education, they quickly are responsive to that because the bigger existential threat of losing access to federal aid. But I actually think in a lot of ways, the overcorrection that we have seen in the last year where schools are actually cracking down on, pro-peace, nonviolent protesters and organizing has been a function of the political environment that we have seen being weaponized rather than the investigations themselves. Now, that could change under a new administration that is more aggressively weaponizing the investigations in the Office for Civil Rights. But right now, I think the reason that we're seeing the proactive calling of police and violence against students and faculty is because no one wants to get called up to Congress and get yelled at by Elise Stefanik and Virginia Fox. I think that is like a bigger weapon that has been used. And even insofar as where President Biden has actually taken steps to undermine the credibility of the Office for Civil Rights and the Department of Education by talking about existing investigations, which is something that the government just doesn't do. If there's an open investigation, you don't touch it, you don't talk about it. In May, after UCLA was essentially UCLA students essentially got attacked by pro-Israeli counter-protesters while the cops watched. And then cops subsequently the next day arrested a bunch of Palestine solidarity organizers and activists who are affiliated with the campus after not doing anything about external people coming onto the campus and attacking people. That sent a very clear message about where the university leadership was. And when the president, within that same time frame, came out and essentially condemned these peaceful, nonviolent protests as anti-Semitic, he was putting his thumb on the scale. He was essentially saying, this is what we believe. And that sent a very clear message to universities that there was not going to be pressure to actually treat anti-war protesters, gently, to actually engage with them in dialogue, to actually try and reach mutual agreements and understanding. That was a political signal that said, bring the cops, do what you need to do to create order, because order is more important than actual justice. Order is more important than ensuring that these students have a safe, inclusive environment. And it was drawing a line that said some discrimination, in my view, in the president's view, was acceptable, so long as it is people who are essentially being treated differently if they are standing in solidarity with Palestinians who our government was providing the money and the weapons to continue harming.
Thank you for that, Thought. I want to turn to some questions here that come into us on the chat. One of them is, what can people do? This comes from a member of our audience. What can people do to push back against the attempt to redefine Title VI so that Zionism becomes a protected class? And that's for anyone who wants to jump in here.
I'm happy to start on this, but I encourage my fellow panelists to jump in as well. Obviously, I think there's been a really aggressive push at the federal level, at the state level, at the institutional level to adopt the IHRA definition, which essentially would protect, or conflate the criticisms of Zionism and of the Israeli government with anti-Semitism, which would essentially codify this idea that you're saying that Zionism is protected. I don't think that it would go as far as to say it is a protected class, but it is creating this entanglement and allowing for that conflation, which is really problematic. What we can do, obviously, I think we're in a political environment that is not great on this issue. We had a House resolution pass overwhelmingly just yesterday on essentially this topic, which would allow for the adoption of the IHRA definition. Now, that is a House resolution. That is not adopting it into Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, but it is a signal about the direction that we're going. And this is a bipartisan effort that is being pushed right now. At the same time, you have Senator Schumer saying, who's the majority leader for Democrats right now, saying that he wants to adopt the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which also adopts the IHRA definition. He wants to add that to the Defense Authorization Act, which is one of the very few must-pass pieces of legislations that Congress pushes through every single year without question. And so when you are taking a position like that as a Democrat with an incoming Trump administration that you anticipate is going to further weaponize civil rights laws in ways that are going to make vulnerable populations even less safe, you're creating the circumstances by which you are making this an inevitability. And so I think first and foremost, what can we do? We have to continue to push back. We have to continue contacting our representatives. We have to continue pushing at the state level to ensure that we are not adopting these bad policies. And we have to make sure that our institutions understand the dangers of what adopting these types of definitions that would stifle and suppress speech on campus would actually do for our student populations, their safety, and also understanding what the broader implications are for other types of discrimination. We don't have definitions for anti-Black hate and discrimination. We don't have definitions for anti-Arab or anti-Muslim hate and discrimination. That's because you can't define or put into a box what is discrimination and what is not. And when you have an overly broad definition, it makes everyone a little bit less safe, and it deprioritizes the other types of discrimination that can and are likely still occurring. And we've seen hate and discrimination on the rise in recent years across a number of different categories. It's not just anti-Semitism that's seeing a rise. We're seeing a huge rise in anti-Black discrimination, a huge rise in discrimination against women, against Muslims, against Arabs. We have to be vigilant about all of those things, not just one, and certainly not when you are conflating and making the real discrimination less when you're conflating it with things that are actually like protected political speech. You are undermining the integrity of the entire civil rights framework.
I also want to add to that, there's the threat of this definition incorporating Zionism being adopted at the institutional level, like state and federal. And there's also what we're seeing, this sort of Zionism being taken as a protected class under universities' own policies. So, for example, at NYU, where earlier this fall, end of summer, they unveiled a policy that seems to say that Zionism is a protected class at NYU. And so so that means, if someone were to file a complaint at their school at NYU for saying that they were targeted because of their support for Israel, that can be seen as discrimination, the same way that discrimination against someone for being Muslim or for being Black can be taken as a complaint. And so I think what can be done to push back in those contexts, especially if you're like an alumni of the university or a donor, there's ways to make your voice heard in those contexts. And I think there's also room for legal avenues, litigation potentially, to address these sorts of concerns. And Yusuf, I just wanted to add one more thing based on the question you had asked me previously about IRA and how courts have treated this. There was a preliminary determination in Texas by a district court that was essentially finding an executive order there to be a viewpoint discrimination. And that executive order was attempting to conflate Zionism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism. And so I think there's still some more to be done in that particular case. This is just a preliminary determination, but I think we are seeing some places where judges are recognizing that it is stifling free speech and it is viewpoint discrimination to say that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are one and the same.
Yeah, and we have a couple more questions here in the chat that I want to make sure we get to before we have to wrap. One from an audience member is for Jay, who was asking here where they can access more information about the data that you guys have collected. And also we have another question on what can we expect effective pro-Palestine activism in universities to look like, considering the increasing crackdown on encampments since May. And Jay, you talked a little bit about how some of the modalities have shifted a little bit since some of the more intense crackdowns have begun. So feel free to address those, and if anyone else wants to jump in on those as well, please do.
Yeah, I'll focus on the first one and mostly leave the second one to the other panelists. But yeah, we all the data we make is public. The larger data set, I can share a link maybe that you can share afterwards, Yusuf. But we also specifically for this movement have an interactive dashboard that's just looking at pro-Palestine activism in the US since last October. So you can get a better sense of the details of some of the events and how widespread they are and see which ones were at schools and that sort of thing. So again, I'll pass those links along. As far as effectiveness, yeah, I think part of what I was getting at was just that it is impressive and a cause for optimism that the movement is showing itself to be adaptable and adapting to these shifts. But I will leave it to others to talk about their thoughts on effectiveness. Yeah.
I mean, I want to hear from others. I'll just say that the deportation discourse is a big threat for people who are international students, and then also the financial repercussions on campuses is pretty dangerous. That was already the issue with what the Zionists were trying to do already, is about, which I wanted to mention earlier, but didn't get a chance, that this really is boiling down to like defunding universities. And so that's also another point here. I don't know what that means for what organizing is going to look like, but people are going to have to contend with those two issues. I'd love to hear from others. Anyone has anything?
I mean, I don't have all the answers, unfortunately, but one thing that I will say is that we've seen already how resilient students and how resilient faculty are on campuses. And I think that is going to be tested, and we're going to have a harder time in the short term. But I feel pretty confident that justice is something that always, ends up coming on top. And I think that we've seen that before. We've seen the stifling of organizing and speech on campuses before, and we've seen students be successful. And so I have no doubt that will continue to be the results here in the future, regardless of how aggressively the backlash is in the temporary short term.
Yeah, and just to kind of go off of that, I think the repression that we're seeing and the increase in repression and what we expect to see, I think, is just, as others have put it, like student organizers is an example of student power and of people power. The fact that this repression is coming down so harshly and that we're expecting, we're not sure what to expect, and that it seems really dire in this moment, I think is an example of how much the movement has achieved so far, and where it's going.
Yeah, I think it's also important to keep in mind here in closing that as these repressive efforts become more naked and transparent, it becomes clear that the sort of cultural hegemony that support for Israel has enjoyed previously is simply non-existent anymore. And the cost of holding on to the status quo of support for Israel in this country is something that protesters are agitating against in unprecedented ways, only requires greater repression and coercion over time and the expansion of greater resources. And that is something that, as effective as it may be in a short term, is hard to imagine as a sustainable system for the future. Thank you all so much for your expertise and your time today. We really appreciated your contributions. And thank you to all those who joined in as part of our audience and sent in questions. We really appreciate you being with us. Please continue to follow the center's work at arabcenterdc.org and have